Robert Falcon Scott was born on the 6th of June 1868, the third of 6 children and eldest son of John Edward, a brewer and magistrate, and his mother, Hannah Scott. Robert's story is one of honour, leadership and courage, a journey and an adventure like no other, one that would cement his name in history. It's a story of one man and his mission. The Scott family had naval and military traditions, Scott's grandfather and 4 uncles all having served in the army or navy. His father John Scott's prosperity came from the ownership of a small Plymouth brewery, which he had inherited from his father and subsequently sold. Scott's early childhood years were spent in comfort, but some years later, when he was establishing his naval career, the family suffered serious financial misfortune. In accordance with the family's traditions, Scott and his younger brother Archie were predestined for careers in the armed services. Scott spent 4 years at a local day school before being sent to Stubbington House School in Hampshire, a cramming establishment that prepared candidates for the entrance examinations to the naval training ship HMS Britannia at Dartmouth. Having passed these exams, Scott began his naval career in 1881 as a 13-year-old cadet. In July 1883, Scott passed out of Britannia as a midshipman, 7th overall in a class of 26. By October, he was en route to South Africa to join HMS Boadicea, the flagship of the Cape Squadron, the first of several ships on which he served during his midshipman years. In March 1888, Scott passed his examinations for sub-lieutenant with 4 first-class certificates out of 5. His career progressed smoothly, with service on various ships and promotion to lieutenant in 1889. In 1891, after a long spell in foreign waters, he applied for the 2-year torpedo training course on HMS Vernon, an important career step. In 1894, while serving as a torpedo officer on the depot ship HMS Vulcan, Scott learned of the financial calamity that had overtaken his family. John Scott, having sold the brewery and invested the proceeds unwisely, had lost all his capital and was now virtually bankrupt. This meant that the whole financial responsibility for the family now rested firmly on Scott's shoulders. In the Royal Navy, however, opportunities for career advancement were both limited and keenly sought after by ambitious officers. Early in June 1899, while home on leave, he had a chance encounter in a London street with Clement Markham, who was now knighted and president of the Royal Geographical Society, and learned for the first time of an impending Antarctic expedition with Discovery. It was the opportunity for early command and a chance to distinguish himself. The British National Antarctic Expedition, later known as the Discovery Expedition, was a joint enterprise of the RGS and the Royal Society. A long-cherished dream of Markham's, it required all of his skills and cunning to bring the expedition to fruition, under naval command and largely staffed by naval personnel. Scott may not have been Markham's first choice as leader, but having decided on him, the older man remained a constant supporter. There were committed battles over the scope of Scott's responsibilities, with the Royal Society pressing to put a scientist in charge of the expedition's programme, while Scott merely commanded the ship. Eventually, however, Markham's view prevailed. Scott was given overall command and was promoted to the rank of commander before Discovery sailed for the Antarctic on the 6th of August 1901. King Edward VII showed a keen interest in the expedition, visited the Discovery the day before the ship left British shores in August 1901, and during the visit appointed Scott a member of the Royal Victorian Order, his personal gift. The expedition had both scientific and exploration objectives. The latter included a journey south in the direction of the South Pole.
This march, undertaken by Scott, Ernest Shackleton and Edward Wilson, took them to a latitude of 82 degrees 17 south, about 530 miles from the pole. A harrowing return journey brought about Shackleton's physical collapse and his early departure from the expedition. The second year showed improvements in technique and achievement, culminating in Scott's western journey, which led to the discovery of the polar plateau. This has been described by one writer as one of the great polar journeys.
At the end of the expedition, it took the combined efforts of 2 relief ships and the use of explosives to free Discovery from the ice. Although there was later tension between Scott and Shackleton when their polar ambitions directly clashed, mutual civilities were preserved in public. Scott joined in the official receptions that greeted Shackleton on his return, and the two exchanged polite letters about their respective ambitions.
Discovery returned to Britain in September 1904. The expedition had caught the public imagination, and Scott became a popular hero. He was awarded a cluster of honours and medals, including many from overseas, and was promoted to the rank of captain. He was invited to Balmoral Castle, where King Edward VII promoted him a Commander of the Royal Victorian Order.
Scott's next few years were crowded. For more than a year, he was occupied with public receptions, lectures, and the writing of the expedition record, The Voyage of the Discovery. In January 1906, he resumed his full-time naval career, and by early 1906, Scott queried the RGS about the possible funding of a future Antarctic expedition.
It was therefore unwelcome news to him that Ernest Shackleton had announced his own plans to travel to Discovery's old McMurdo Sound base and launch a bid for the South Pole from there. Scott claimed in the first of a series of letters to Shackleton that the area around McMurdo was his own field of work, to which he had prior rights until he chose to give them up, and that Shackleton should therefore work from an entirely different area.
In this, he was strongly supported by Discovery's former zoologist, Edward Wilson, who asserted that Scott's right extended to the entire Ross Sea sector. This Shackleton refused to concede. Finally, to end the impasse, Shackleton agreed in a letter to Scott dated 17th of May 1907 to work to the east of the 170° west meridian and therefore to avoid all the familiar Discovery ground.
In the end, it was a promise that he was unable to keep after his search for alternative landing grounds proved fruitless. With his only other option being to return home, he set up his headquarters at Cape Royds, close to the old Discovery base, and for this he was roundly condemned by the British polar establishment at the time.
Scott, who because of his Discovery fame had entered Edwardian society and first met Kathleen Bruce early in 1907 at a private luncheon party.
She was a sculptress, socialite and cosmopolitan who had studied under Auguste Rodin and whose circle of friends included Isadora Duncan, Pablo Picasso and Aleister Crowley. Her initial meeting with Scott was brief, but when they met again later that year, the mutual attraction was obvious.
A stormy courtship followed. Scott was not her only suitor. His main rival was a would-be novelist, Gilbert Cannon, and his absences at sea did not assist his cause.
However, Scott's persistence was rewarded, and on the 2nd of September 1908, at the Chapel Royal Hampton Court Palace, the wedding took place. Their only child, Peter Markham Scott, was born on September the 14th, 1909. He went on to found the Worldwide Fund for Nature.
Shackleton returned from the Antarctic having narrowly failed to reach the pole, and this gave Scott the impetus to proceed with plans for his second Antarctic expedition. On the 24th of March 1909, he took the Admiralty-based appointment of Naval Assistant to the 2nd Sea Lord, which placed him conveniently in London. In December, he was released on half pay to take up the full-time command of the British Antarctic Expedition in 1910, to be known as the Terra Nova Expedition, from its ship, Terra Nova.
In a memorandum of 1908, Scott presented his view that man-hauling to the South Pole was impossible and that motor traction was needed. Snow vehicles did not yet exist, however, and so his engineer Reginald Skelton developed the idea of a caterpillar track for snow surfaces. In the middle of 1909, Scott realised that motors were unlikely to get him all the way to the pole, and decided additionally to take horses, dogs and skis.
On the 15th of June 1910, Scott's ship Terra Nova, an old converted whaler, set sail from Cardiff in South Wales. Scott meanwhile was fundraising in Britain and joined the ship later in South Africa. Arriving in Melbourne, Australia in October 1910, Scott received a telegram from Amundsen stating, "Beg leave to inform you from preceding Antarctic Amundsen, possibly indicating that Scott faced a race to the pole. The expedition suffered a series of early misfortunes which hampered the first season's work and impaired preparations for the main polar march. On its journey from New Zealand to the Antarctic, Terra Nova nearly sank in a storm and was then trapped in pack ice for 20 days.
Deteriorating weather conditions and weak, unacclimatised ponies affected the initial depot lane journey, so that the expedition's main supply point, 1 Ton Depot, was laid 35 miles north of its planned location at 80 degrees south. Lawrence Oates, in charge of the ponies, advised Scott to kill them for food and then advance to the depot, which Scott refused to do. Oates is reported as saying to Scott, "Sir, I'm afraid you'll come to regret not taking my advice." 4 ponies died during this journey, either from the cold or because they slowed the team down and were shot.
On its return to base, the expedition learned of the presence of Amundsen, camped with his crew and a large contingent of dogs in the Bay of Whales, 200 miles to their east. Scott conceded that his ponies would not be able to start early enough in the season to compete with Amundsen's cold-tolerant dog teams for the pole, and also acknowledged that the Norwegians' base was closer to the pole by 69 miles. Shortly afterwards, the death toll among the ponies increased to 6, with 3 drowning when sea ice unexpectedly disintegrated, casting in doubt the possibility of reaching the pole at all.
Scott outlined his plans for the southern journey to the entire shore party, leaving open who would form the final polar team, according to their performance during the polar travel. 11 days before Scott's team set off towards the pole, Scott gave the dog driver Mears the following written orders at Cape Evans, dated 20th of October 1911, to secure Scott's speedy return from the pole using dogs.
The march south began on the 1st of November 1911. A caravan of mixed transport groups, motors, dogs and horses, with loaded sledges travelling at different rates, all designed to support a final group of 4 men who would make a dash for the pole. The southbound party steadily reduced in size as successive support teams turned back, but Scott reminded the returning Sergeant Lieutenant Atkinson of the order to take the 2 dog teams south in the event of Mears having to return home, as seemed likely.
By the 4th of January 1912, the last 2 4-man groups had reached 87 degrees 34 south. Scott announced his decision. 5 men, himself, Wilson, Bowers, Oates and Edgar Evans would go forward. The other 3, Teddy Evans, William Lashley and Tom Crean, would return. The chosen group marched on, reaching the pole on the 17th of January, only to find that Amundsen had preceded them by 5 weeks. Scott's anguish is indicated in his diary. "The worst has happened. All the daydreams must go. Great God, this is an awful place."
The deflated party began the 862-mile return journey on the 19th of January. "I'm afraid the return journey is going to be dreadfully tiring and monotonous," wrote Scott on that day. The party made good progress despite poor weather and had completed the polar plateau stage of their journey approximately 300 miles by the 7th of February. But in the following days, as the party made the 100-mile descent of the Beardmore Glacier, the physical condition of Edgar Evans, which Scott had noted with concern as early as the 23rd of January, declined sharply.
With 400 miles still to travel across the Ross Ice Shelf, Scott's party's prospects steadily worsened, as with deteriorating weather, a puzzling lack of fuel in the depots, hunger and exhaustion, they struggled northward.
On the return journey from the poles, Scott reached the 82 degrees south meeting point for the dog teams, 300 miles from Hut Point and 3 days ahead of schedule. Noting in his diary for the 27th of February 1912, "We are naturally always discussing possibility of meeting dogs, where and when, etc. It is a critical position. We may find ourselves in safety at the next depot, but there is a horrid element of doubt." On the 2nd of March, Oates began to suffer from the effects of frostbite and the party's progress slowed as he was increasingly unable to assist in the workload. Eventually only able to drag himself alongside the men pulling the sledge, by the 10th of March, the temperature had dropped unexpectedly to below minus 40 degrees.
In a farewell letter to Sir Edgar Speyer, dated 16th of March, Scott wondered whether he had overshot the meeting point and fought the growing suspicion that he had in fact been abandoned by the dog teams. "We very nearly came through and it's a pity to have missed it, but lately I have felt that we have overshot our mark. No one is to blame, and I hope no attempt will be made to suggest that we had lacked support. On the same day, Oates, whose toes had become frostbitten, voluntarily left the tent and walked to his death. Scott wrote that Oates' last words were, "I am just going outside and maybe some time."
After walking 20 miles farther despite Scott's toes now becoming frostbitten, the 3 remaining men made their final camp on the 19th of March, approximately 12.5 miles short of One Ton Depot. The next day a fierce blizzard prevented them making any progress. During the next 9 days, as their supplies ran out and with storms still raging outside the tent, Scott and his companions wrote their farewell letters.
Scott gave up his diary after the 23rd of March, save for a final entry on the 29th of March, with its concluding words, "Last entry, for God's sake, look after our people." He left letters to Wilson's mother, Bauer's mother, a string of notables including his former commander, Sir George Egerton, his own mother and his wife. Scott is presumed to have died on the 29th of March 1912, or possibly one day later. The positions of the bodies in the tent when it was discovered 8 months later suggested that Scott was the last of the 3 to die.
The bodies of Scott and his companions were discovered by a search party on the 12th of November 1912 and their records retrieved. Trygve Granner was part of the search party, described the scene as snow-covered till up above the door, with Scott in the middle, half out of his bag. The frost had made the skin yellow and transparent, and I've never seen anything worse in my life. Their final camp became their tomb. The tent roof was lowered over the bodies and a high cairn of snow was erected over it, topped by a roughly fashioned cross, erected using Gran's skis.
In January 1913, before Terra Nova left for home, a large wooden cross was made by the ship's carpenters, inscribed with the names of the lost party and Tennyson's line from his poem Ulysses, "To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." It was erected as a permanent memorial on Observation Hill, overlooking Hut Point.
The world was informed of the tragedy when Terra Nova reached Oamaru in New Zealand on the 10th of February 1913. Within days, Scott became a national icon. A nationalistic spirit was aroused, and the London Evening News called for the story to be read to school children throughout the land to coincide with the memorial service at St Paul's Cathedral on the 14th of February. Robert Baden-Powell, founder of the Boy Scouts Association, asked, "Are Britons going downhill?" No, there is plenty of pluck and spirit left in the British after all. Captain Scott and Captain Oates have shown us that.
According to some, Scott's reputation was as variable as the climatic conditions of the time. He has been called a bungler, one who should hold a significant responsibility to the failure of his mission. But also Scott's ability and eventual horrific waste tainted him. The ideals of duty, self-sacrifice, discipline, patriotism and hierarchy associated with his tragedy leave us with a memory of a man who, like any other adventurer, aimed high, aimed to be the best and aimed for success. He lost men but gave his life doing what he thought was right, and no one can taint him or his men for their heroic battle to survive.